So I would like to introduce you to Dr. Raz Zimmt, who is going to be our speaker today. He's the director of the Iran Shiite Axis Research Program at the Institute for National Security at the INSS, and a research fellow at the Alliance Center for Iranian Study in Tel Aviv. So, Raz, thank you so much for joining us today in these days where these negotiations between Iran and the US are taking place. And take it from there. The introduction and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Oren. It's always a pleasure to be hosted by Wikistrat. Let me give you some updates and my general remarks. I'll try to be brief to leave more time for the Q&As. Look, this is a time of many uncertainties, political spins, disinformation. Whenever there is negotiations between Iran and the United States, and in general, during times of negotiations, there are a lot of uncertainties. So I'll try to mention one thing which, in my view, is very clear after 5 rounds of talks between Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Arakchi, and ahead of the 6th meeting, which is going to take place in Muscat on Sunday. And I think that if we want to mention just one thing which is very obvious, I think by now, is that both sides, both Tehran and Washington, really wants to get some kind of agreement. Now, I'm saying some kind of agreement because I'm certainly not sure that Iran or the United States are looking for a comprehensive deal, just like the one signed during the JCPOA in 2015. But it's very clear that both the United States and Tehran recognize the risks involved in the collapse of those talks. And nobody wants that. Trump certainly doesn't want to be engaged in any kind of military escalation, certainly not between the United States and Iran, but also not between Israel and Iran, because such an escalation could certainly drag the United States into that kind of escalation as well. Tehran, from its side, certainly is aware of the risks of being dragged into some kind of military escalation with either Israel or the United States. It wants, and it certainly requires, some kind of sanctions relief, perhaps the unfreezing of its assets abroad due to the economic situation inside Iran. So both sides want to engage in talks, want those talks to evolve into some kind of agreement. Having said that, there are still, in my view, 3 main constraints which are certainly put a major question mark over the possibility of reaching a deal at the end of the day. The first thing, or the first constraint, is the fact that there is almost total mistrust between the 2 sides. The Americans don't trust the Iranians. The Iranians certainly don't trust the Americans. They certainly don't trust this particular president who was responsible for withdrawing from the JCPOA back in May 2018, who was responsible as president in his first term for ordering the assassination of General Soleimani in January 2020. So Supreme Leader Khamenei, who just until recently said that any talks with the United States, and particularly with this administration, is futile, he still doesn't trust the Americans. So this is one constraint, this is one problem. The second problem, which in my view is perhaps the number one obstacle, is that there are a lot of technical details and problems which have to be overcome. The most important obstacle right now, as some of you probably know, is the question of whether Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium inside Iran. Currently, there are 2 red lines which cannot be bridged. The Iranian red line is very clear. We will never give up our right to enrich uranium inside Iran, whether temporarily or and certainly not forever. The American position, at least for now, although we are not certain that the same public position by the United States is the same as the position presented to the Iranians in the negotiating rooms, but at least publicly, President Trump, his advisor, and Mr. Witkoff have made it very clear that the United States will not allow any kind of enrichment inside Iran, meaning the full dismantling of Iran's enrichment capabilities inside Iran. This has to be bridged some way. They have to get some kind of a solution, a creative solution, which will take both sides' red lines and try to bridge over them. But I have to say that even if there is a solution to this major obstacle of Iran's right to enrich uranium inside its territory, there are a lot of other problems. For example, what to do with the stockpiles of enriched uranium accumulated by Iran in recent years. What to do with the more than 13,000 advanced centrifuges the Iranians have. Back then, in 2015, when the JCPOA was signed, Iran had just about 1,000 advanced centrifuges. So back then, the dismantling of those advanced centrifuges, even without being destroyed, was enough to keep Iran at least 1 year away from breakout capability. This time, 10 years later, even if all those centrifuges, more than 13,000 of them, are going to be dismantled, but not destroyed or sent abroad away of Iran, this will not be enough to prevent Iran from continuing be considered as a threshold state. So there are a lot of technical details to be decided. The last constraint is of course, the very tight schedule. And by that, I don't mean Mr. Trump's deadline, which is going to expire in the next 2 days. But I mostly mean the snapback, this mechanism, which was part of the JCPOA and allows the Europeans to trigger this mechanism and to reimpose sanctions on Iran without Russia and China being able to impose veto in the Security Council. As most of you know, the IAEA recent reports on Iran published last week was very significant, very concerning. And I think it's going to be today or tomorrow that for the first time in 2 decades, the IAEA Board of Governors is going to adopt a resolution to declare Iran as non-compliant to the NPT. So if there is no agreement between Iran and the United States by, let's say, the end of July, the beginning of August, when the Europeans have to start triggering this mechanism of snapback, we're certainly heading towards escalation. The Iranians have already made it very clear that in case of triggering the snapback, they will withdraw from the NPT. And that, of course, may lead us to a very dangerous escalation with Iran. I have to say that I find it very unlikely that both sides will reach a comprehensive deal or even an interim agreement due to the time frame we have until late July, the beginning of August. So we might find ourselves in a situation where both sides, the Americans and the Iranians, agree to sign a kind of a joint declaration of principles. And that might be enough for both Trump and the Iranian leadership to come up and say, okay, we managed to prevent an escalation, we managed to prevent a crisis, and now we will negotiate over the technical details we still have in the next few years or in the next few months. I have to say that, and we can discuss it during the Q&As, I'm very much concerned with this possibility because I think that such a declaration of principles, if it's too general, even if it manages to somehow bridge the gap between the United States and Iran, might leave us in a situation where the sense of urgency, both in Washington and Tehran, declines very significantly. The Iranians will have no desire to reach a comprehensive deal. They can certainly be satisfied with a general agreement under which they receive some kind of sanctions relief, perhaps unfreezing of some of their assets. Mr. Trump will be able to say, I prevented the war with the Iranians, and we might find ourselves in a situation where there is no snapback, no Israeli military attack against Iran, and the two sides might negotiate things for a very long time in the next few months or even more than that. The last point I would like to make is if talks collapse, if the United States, at the end of the day, despite its very clear willingness to reach a deal, if the United States finally make it very clear that the talks collapse, and we've already heard today Mr. Trump saying that he's less confident than before concerning the possibility of reaching a deal with Iran, this, in my view, will certainly increase very significantly the prospects for a military action, especially by Israel. I'm not sure that the Americans at this point will be ready to take part in such a military action against Iran, although the Americans were quite, we heard over the last few weeks and months some contradictory statements made by President Trump. At some point, he said that if talks collapse, Israel is going to attack Iran. At other points, he said if talks collapse, the United States is going to lead the campaign against Iran. But the possibility for an Israeli military attack certainly increases in case of the talks being collapsed. And here I have to say, and I'll end with that, we have to take into consideration three main factors when it comes to Israeli decision to military strike Iran. One, it's very clear by now that Israel is not going to be able to strike Iran without any kind of former coordination with the United States. Even if Israel reaches the conclusion that it can certainly strike Iran by its own, but at least it will have to coordinate such a strike with the Americans, because we will need the United States to support Israel in case of an Iranian retaliation. So I think that it's very unlikely to presume that if President Trump continues to say, don't do that, don't giving Israel a red light from attacking Iran, I think it's very unlikely to presume that under those circumstances, Israel will do that alone. The second point I would make is that we can certainly expect an Iranian retaliation. And I have to say, while we should not underestimate Israel's capability to strike Iran and the damage that Israel can inflict on Iran's nuclear program, we should also not underestimate Iranian ability to retaliate. Iran still, even after the Israeli recent attack against Iran in late October, still have more than 2,000 ballistic missiles. They can certainly inflict major damage to Israel. Israel will probably try to degrade some of those capabilities in case of an attack, but we should not underestimate Iran's capability. The last point we have to take into consideration is the fact that any kind of a military attack, whether it's Israeli or even a joint Israeli-American military strike, will not be able to destroy 100% of Iran's nuclear program. There's going to be some remains when it comes to centrifuges, to fissile material, certainly to knowledge and technology concerning the nuclear program. So even in the best scenario, when there is a successful military strike, we are probably talking about a delay. How much? It could be a 1-year delay, it could be 2 years away, but at the end of the day, we have to assume that following an Israeli or an American attack, we should expect Iran's efforts to reconstitute its program and perhaps even to break out to nuclear weapon, because then they will say, look, you attacked us, we are no longer capable to preserve our status as just a threshold state. They will kick out the IAEA inspectors, and then we should expect Iranian efforts to rehabilitate their infrastructure. This means that even in case of a military strike, we are talking about just the first stage towards a continued campaign launched by either Israel or together with the United States through military efforts or through covert activities in order to make sure that Iran doesn't try to use what remains of Iran's nuclear capabilities in order to try and reconstitute their nuclear program. I will end here, and I will be happy to address your questions.
Thank you, Raz. Very, very interesting. I'm going to start. The first question is actually a little bit of understanding of the Iranian leadership, how critical it is for them to maintain that ability to enrich uranium within Iranian territory, because it seems that that is basically the core issue of these negotiations.
This is the main. This is the main thing. This is a red line. I think they can never give it up. And the reason for that is that the meaning of giving up their right to enrich uranium inside Iran means that in case, it's not just a matter of national pride or a national right. They have always considered the nuclear program as a kind of insurance for the stability of the regime, meaning that if they make a decision in the future, if Khamenei makes a decision in the future, or his successor makes a decision, that he needs to break out for weapons. They want to acquire weapons in order to deter their enemies, whether it's United States or Israel or someone else. They don't want to be in a situation in which they have to rely on someone else to deliver them the fuel in case they need. They don't trust the Russians. They don't trust the Chinese. They certainly don't trust this kind of consortium owned by the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And therefore, whoever talks about full dismantling of enrichment capabilities inside Iran, meaning the so-called Libyan model, I have to say that when we speak about the Libyan model, or the Americans speak about the Libyan model, we usually think about Muammar Gaddafi giving up his nuclear program in 2003. But when Khamenei, when the supreme leader thinks about the Libyan model, he thinks about the execution of Gaddafi, and he doesn't want to be in the same position. So I would say that even in case Khamenei and the Iranian leadership has to choose between giving up this idea of enrichment inside Iran and taking the risk of a military strike either by Israel or even by the United States, my sense is that they will take the risk and not going to give up this idea. They are ready to make major significant concessions when it comes to other issues. For example, the level of enrichment, they have already made it very clear that they are ready to accept not more than 3.67% enrichment. They are ready to establish this kind of regional consortium, but not as a substitute to the two sites already activated inside Iran. They are ready to perhaps to accept the term or the condition that they will never be able to enrich uranium to over 6.67%, not like what was mentioned at the JCPOA, but they will never, in my view, give up the idea of indigenous enrichments inside Iran.
You mentioned JCPOA, and that was the previous agreement which the U.S. withdrew under the first Trump administration. One of the main issues, one of the main critiques that Israel had during that time was that the JCPOA did not address aspects related to the missile program, did not address aspects related to funding of other actors such as the Houthis, Hezbollah, and so on. So primarily from that perspective, that was considered to be a bad deal. From the Israeli perspective, from the Israeli leadership perspective. How much do you think would that be considered a bad deal if those issues are not included in this deal that we're going into and that they're being negotiated today?
So the main objection in Israel towards the JCPOA was not the issue of regional issues and missiles, although that was certainly part of the criticism. The main criticism was due to the flaws within the JCPOA, which involved mostly the issue that it maintained all the nuclear infrastructures inside Iran, meaning that Iran had to roll back its program, but all the facilities, all the centrifuges remain inside Iran. So the Israeli concern was that in case Iran decides to violate the deal, it will be able to use those facilities and those infrastructures in order to enrich uranium and break out if they decide to. So right now, the Israeli position is very clear, and publicly, it's the same as the American position. we will not accept any kind of a deal which doesn't include the full dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities and infrastructure, including the enrichment capabilities. Having said that, there is certainly a concern with the fact that the two other issues, the missiles and the regional issues, are not discussed in the deal. But again, I think that there is, for example, this issue, which is a concern, what Iran might do with all the economic benefits it could enjoy following a deal with the United States, with all the billions of dollars it could use for missiles and for its regional proxies. But I think that especially today, following the weakening of the so-called Shiite Axis, or the resistance axis, as the Iranians refer to that, I think that the major concern in Israel is not due to the fact that the regional issue is off the table, but the major concern is that Mr. Trump will agree to a certain agreement which doesn't involve the full dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities. If there is a deal which means zero enrichment, zero centrifuges, zero fissile material, I don't think that the issue of missiles, and certainly not the regional issues, will be the main focus of the Israeli position.
One of the aspects that's being discussed a lot is about that the attack that if an attack is carried either by Israel or Israel and the United States or the United States, such an attack will not only target the nuclear facilities, but maybe also some of the economic infrastructure, primarily when it comes to the ports and the ability to extract oil and to export it and so on, and by that damaging the economy quite fatally, the Iranian economy. How much do you think that is a threat, that is a gun on the table that the Iranian regime currently is concerned about when they address this negotiation versus the ability to basically say, you know what, we may have to endure an attack and we might have to endure some difficult times, but the benefit will be the rally around the flag, so it might be even kind of a blessing in disguise for us?
So first, I think that one of the problems and one of the risks involved in a military escalation is that you know how to start it, but you can never tell where it ends. So even if the assumption, and my assumption is that if it's going to be a unilateral Israeli attack rather than a joint Israeli-American strike, which could certainly involve more than just striking the nuclear facilities or the missiles capabilities, I think that Israel will not target infrastructures or even symbols of the regime in the first strike. The problem is that if we assume, and it's very likely that Iran at this point will retaliate and could inflict a major damage and perhaps even casualties in Israel, the next stage could certainly be to expand the Israeli attacks to further military targets. At the end of the day, perhaps even some economic oil installations and infrastructure. So this is a thing which the Iranians certainly have to take into consideration. But in a way, they also hold responsibility for the way this confrontation evolves. This morning, we heard the Iranian Ministry of Defense, for example, saying that in case of a military escalation between Iran and Israel and the United States, Iran is going to target US bases as well in the region. Now, I find it very difficult to believe that if the United States doesn't participate directly in an attack by Israel, the Iranians will retaliate against US bases in the region. It seems to be very suicidal. But if this confrontation between Israel and Iran continues and evolves, there is certainly a risk which the Iranian leadership has to take into consideration. And therefore, it goes back to what I said before at the beginning, that I don't think the Iranians want to be engaged in a military confrontation. They certainly want to reach some kind of an agreement, but not at any cost. And you also mentioned, Oren, the issue of rally around the flag. This is something which we are struggling with to understand whether an Israeli attack or an Israeli-American attack could really rally the Iranian people around the flag. If you would ask me 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would certainly say yes. In case of an Israeli attack against Iran, we will probably see a rally around the flag from the Iranian population. I have to say that due to the deep legitimacy crisis suffered by the Islamic Republic, and the fact that there is a problem of national solidarity right now in Iran, due to the growing gap between the Iranian regime and the population. I'm not sure that any kind of an Israeli attack, certainly if it's only against some kind of nuclear facilities, military targets, IRGC headquarters, I'm not sure that this will indeed encourage the public to stand behind the regime. There are those in Israel who believe, and I don't believe that actually an Israeli attack against Iran will do the opposite, weaken the Iranian regime up to a point when we could expect perhaps even a regime change. I think that the reality will be more complicated than that.
I want to go over some scenarios, and there's a question here that we received from the audience that I want to kind of include in a scenario. So one of the scenarios is that potentially we're going to see kind of a limited attack to kind of show the potential of what an attack would be look like, and that after the attack there will be another round of negotiations. How much do you think will either side consider such a thing, that the actual attack is a part of the diplomacy versus a final solution, or basically concluding of the diplomacy? So one is more of an attack as part of the diplomatic efforts to reach a better deal, pressuring on Iran, showing them capability, versus an attack is the final end of the negotiations and only escalatory from that point on.
First of all, any kind of attack, whether it's limited attack or comprehensive attack, is not the end of the day, and the next stage would certainly be a political kind of solution. As I mentioned, there is no way to destroy 100% of Iran's nuclear program. So even if the attack, whether it's Israeli or American, is successful, we will not be able to guarantee that the Iran's nuclear program is 100% destroyed, and therefore we will need a political leg at the end of the day, which will involve some kind of agreement between Iran and the United States, hopefully a better one than that being negotiated right now. But I think there are at least two problems with the assumption that even a limited attack could lead to such renewed negotiations between Iran and the United States from a new starting point. One is that I don't think we can guarantee that it's going to end by a limited strike. Even if Israel decides to strike only one or two nuclear facilities and to inflict limited damage to Natanz or Fordo and try to degrade some missiles capabilities, the ball goes to Iran, and if Iran decides to retaliate, and I certainly expect Iran to retaliate, as they did in April following the killing of their officer in Damascus, and then in October. Let's assume they retaliate. In case of damage and certainly casualties caused by this retaliation, there's going to be an Israeli retaliation. So there is no way to guarantee that we end up with just one limited strike with no Iranian response and renewed negotiations. And the second doubt I have is whether the Iranians will accept renewed negotiations in the day after an attack. They might do that, but they might reach the conclusion. And again, it goes back to the question of how successful such an attack is. If, for example, the Iranians, before an attack or even after attack, manages to take some amount of centrifuges, some amount of fissile material, hide it somewhere in the desert in Iran, and then they might decide that following an Israeli attack, as limited as it could be, they try to take all those materials and break out as soon as possible. So I don't rule out the possibility of a limited attack, but I'm not sure that it could maintain limited, and I'm not sure that even a limited attack could lead to a successful negotiations following it.
Now, another question from the audience, and I'm going to include into that some background. So we saw when there was the military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen carried by the United States under this administration, that at some point an agreement was made, which kind of was very good for US/European allies, but did not address any of the concerns Israel had, which was the shooting of missiles and naval navigation to its ports. How much do you think there is an alignment between Israel and the United States on this topic of the nuclear deal, considering what we saw in Yemen, considering that the US has its own interests, this administration has its own interests?
First of all, unfortunately, it's not just the example of the Houthis. We had other examples in recent months and weeks for the United States acting according to its own interest, which is very understandable. We saw the removal of sanctions over Syria as another example. The United States was not asking Israel whether this was the right decision to do. I think that at the end of the day, there is a common objective by the United States and Israel, and that's to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. At least for now, it also seems that there is a common interest to prevent Iran from enriching uranium inside Iran. But again, I think that the main interest by the United States and certainly by Mr. Trump is to prevent a military escalation, military attack. I think there are more and more voices inside Israel, both within the political establishment in Israel and also within the security military establishment in Israel, which said this is perhaps the last opportunity we have to deal with this Iran's nuclear threat. We managed to degrade Hamas. We managed to win the war against Hezbollah. The Assad regime collapsed. The only real problem, strategic problem Israel is still facing is Iran's nuclear program. And this is the window of opportunity we've been waiting for in order to take care of this issue. And here I think there could certainly be a difference between the US position, which wants to prevent a military escalation because it doesn't serve the interests of the United States. Trump certainly heard his counterparts in the Gulf during his last visit in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar. They were saying the same thing. Please make efforts to reach an agreement with the Iranians. We don't want further escalation in the region. It will jeopardize our own interests. And I'm not sure that at the end of the day, when Trump's make a decision, if he has to choose between an agreement which doesn't include the full dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities and even allowing Iran certain level of enrichment, I'm not sure that in this case he will take into consideration the Israeli interest to make sure that there is no enrichment whatsoever inside Iran.
How much is this a situation of peace or war and not an in-between situation? Meaning, from the perspective of the negotiations fails, how likely are we to see an attack versus basically kind of a continuation of the status quo? Because in the past, we have seen negotiations that fail. We have seen that the situation was that Iran was enriching uranium up to a threshold point, but was not basically stepping up that level of basically production into the ability to have nuclear. I mean, the actual having the nuclear weapons. So what happens if negotiations failed? Iran decided not to enrich the uranium, but Israel decided not to attack. How likely is that a potential scenario in your opinion?
My sense is that Israel is very much eager to strike Iran. And therefore, it's just waiting for the first opportunity to do that. And now, if talks collapse or if talks fail, and President Trump tells Prime Minister Netanyahu, look, we have lost this opportunity to reach an agreement with Iran, but still, I think there are some we still have some time to reach an agreement with Iran in the next few months, and therefore don't do anything militarily against Iran. At this point, Israel will certainly try to convince Trump otherwise. But again, as I said before, I think it's very unlikely to presume that Israel will strike Iran without at least some kind of yellow light, if not green light, from Trump. But I think that if there is even a message relayed by President Trump to the Israelis, look, I tried to reach an agreement with Iran. It didn't work out. Now it's up to you to decide what to do. At this point, I find it very likely that Israel would use this opportunity in order to strike Iran, even if it understands that it's going to be a unilateral Israeli action. and that we only can rely on our US friends in order to support Israel from the defensive point of view.
So from an Israeli position, the return of maximum pressure, the return of heavy sanctions by the US, even heavier than now, and so on, is not acceptable. Basically, it's an all or nothing kind of a situation.
In a way, it is, because I think that Israel has already realized that economic pressure by its own cannot deliver. Even if Mr. Trump manages to somehow lower the oil exports from Iran to China significantly, from 1.5 million to less than 1 million, I think that Israel realizes by now that even if the economic pressure continues and even increases, this by its own will not force Iran into making the decision to give up its nuclear achievements and its nuclear enrichment. And therefore, the Israeli position has always been, even after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, that economic pressure by its own is not enough. And unless the Iranian leadership is facing not just economic pressure, but also a very credible military threat, Iran will not be forced into making concessions. And of course, there is also, as I said before, the issue of Israeli recognition of this operational window of opportunity. Hezbollah is down; it's not out. We have seen more and more indications that Iran is trying to rehabilitate Hezbollah's capabilities, not very successfully, I would have to say, but only a few days ago, the Syrian security forces managed to stop deliveries of weapons, probably originated in Iran, to Hezbollah. We've seen the recent attack by Israel in the Dahya in Beirut, targeting Iranian efforts to continue the production of drones in Beirut. And the Iranians are already making a huge effort to rehabilitate their aerial defense system, which were targeted by Israel in late October. There are more indications that Iran is trying to purchase missile components from China following the attack in late October. So this window of opportunity due to the weakening of Iran's deterrence vis-a-vis Israel can at certain point be over. And therefore, I think that Israel will not wait much longer to see whether Iran is ready to accept more concessions just through economic pressure.
There are some in the Israeli defense establishment, but also political leadership that are calling not just for an attack on the nuclear facilities, but also for a complete regime change and to basically try to create a situation where the regime is toppled and a collapse of the regime and replaced. How realistically it is that you will see something like that Israel carries out not just an attack from the perspective of attacking the nuclear facilities, but targeting the regime stability itself? And how likely are we to see the United States as part of such an effort?
The United States right now is not after regime change. I think Mr. Trump was very clear in saying we are not going to encourage regime change in anywhere, not even in Iran. They're not going to do that. From the Israeli point of view, there are those who say, yeah, if Israel attacks Iran, its nuclear facilities, its military installations, perhaps at some point symbols of the Iranian regime or some installation, this could perhaps weaken the Iranian regime up to a point where it could threaten the stability of the Iranian regime. I don't think that this is the objective. I think that it could, of course, be part of a major comprehensive campaign against Iran. But the main issue is to delay as much as possible Iran's nuclear program. And concerning the prospects for regime change, you probably know my position for many years that a regime change in Iran is something which could certainly happen at some point due to major trends within Iran and the growing gap between the Iranian regime and the Iranian population, and due to the economic problems of Iran. But it can take 2 months, it can take 2 years, and it can take 2 decades. And I personally don't believe that a military external strike could could bring out a regime change. The regime change is 90% dependent on the Iranian people inside Iran. Any kind of successful strike by Israel, certainly by the United States, would certainly weaken the Iranian regime, but I'm not sure it's enough to bring out millions of Iranians to the streets and to create this coalition of forces, which in my view is very much required in order to have a regime change in Iran.
Looking at the goal that the United States and Israel have, which is basically delaying or basically denying Iran from having nuclear weapons, how much of an attack on those nuclear facilities is really the best option versus a diplomatic solution that will prevent that or delay the ability of having those kind of weapons for 10 or 15 years versus an attack that we don't know for how long it will prevent/delay the Iranian from achieving those nuclear weapons?
That's exactly the dilemma. I think that there are two main concerns in Israel concerning the possibility of an agreement with Iran. One is the fact that any kind of agreement, due to the red lines presented by Iran, will not involve the full dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities and enrichment. This could perhaps be more possible through a military strike. And the second issue is the issue we discussed earlier, and that's the issue of sanctions relief, which could strengthen the Iranian regime following an agreement between Iran and the United States. But you certainly point out to the main issue, I think. It's probably possible to reach a political settlement with Iran, which would perhaps delay Iran's nuclear program by, not forever, okay, because no agreement is forever, but perhaps for 10, 15, 20 years from now, compared to 1 or 2 years of delay in case of a military strike. And that leads me personally to believe that a political solution could be certainly better than a military strike. And I have to say, unlike the official position of the Israeli government, I personally believe that an agreement between Iran and the United States could be satisfactory, even from the Israeli point of view, even if it involves a certain level of enrichment inside Iran. I think that if Iran is allowed to enrich uranium up to a low level of 3.67 with a major significant constraints on enrichment beyond 3.67, with much more significant supervision by the IAEA, more verification. We have to take such an agreement will certainly have to take into consideration the flows and the problems of the JCPOA when it comes, for example, to the IAEA ability to inspect non-declared installation inside Iran. Iran perhaps should be forced into accepting the additional protocol of the NPT. Some restrictions should be made on not just on enrichment, but also, for example, on any kind of activity Iran can take when it comes to weaponization efforts. So there are a lot of things which could be included in a political deal, which could make such a deal a reasonable deal. But again, it goes back to the Iranians. If the Iranians, for example, refuse to send all the fissile material they have accumulated in recent years from Iran, if they do not agree to destroy or to deliver the advanced centrifuges outside Iran, I think we have a problem. And in that case, the advantages of a military strike could perhaps be more significant than the advantages of a political settlement. I do think that there is a possibility to reach some kind of an agreement between the United States and Iran, which would allow a satisfactory situation when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. But Iran will have to agree to very significant concessions.
In your opinion, what is the reason the Iranian leadership hasn't gone through the process of going from a threshold country to a nuclear country? What's holding them back?
There are very clear understanding, and I think it's very this is the right understanding that in case they break out or make a decision to break out, whether it's through withdrawal from the NPT and reach uranium to 90%, or the renewal of the so-called weaponization group, this will certainly mean an immediate military strike either by Israel or the United States. As it's very important to note that Iran is a week away from breaking out capability, but it's still about 6 months away from acquiring nuclear warhead. They're still 2 years, more or less, away from acquiring a fully operational missiles capability, which can deliver a nuclear device. And so if the situation was that Iran, in a matter of days or weeks, would acquire nuclear weapons, they might have decided to do that. But the fact is that they are still at least 6 months away, probably more than that if they want to achieve the full operational capabilities from acquiring a weapon. And that means that if they decide to do that, they're very much exposed to a military response either by Israel or the United States.
So in that case, in a scenario of a military attack, be it successful, partially successful, or not really successful, it's likely to see an Iranian leadership deciding that we already paid the cost, so from now on we can already talk about moving from threshold to a nuclear country. Or do you think that a military attack is not going, it's not likely to lead to that?
It could certainly encourage a decision by the Iranian leadership to break out, but, and this is a very big but, if they reach the conclusion that this was only the first stage in a campaign against Iran, and the next stage could target not just nuclear sites or military strikes, but, for example, national infrastructures, more expanded targets inside Iran, which at some point could threaten the stability of the regime, this could be certainly a factor within the Iranian calculation. I think they will certainly want to break out. They will make an effort to reconstitute their program, but it all goes back to what are the consequences of such an attack, and whether the Iranians reach the conclusion that Israel or the United States could inflict an even more significant damage, which could evolve into a threat to the stability of the regime.
From the perspective of the Iranian leadership, what kind of voices do we see, the so-called hawks versus doves that we see in every conflict or in every kind of a security dilemma? How would you describe the hawks and how would you describe the doves in this situation, looking into the Iranian leadership?
So the hawks, and I have to say that over the last few weeks, since Khamenei said that he supports negotiations with the United States, we haven't seen too much of the so-called ultra-revolutionary conservatives inside Iran. This has a little bit changed over the last few days. I think it goes back to the sense in Tehran that the prospects for agreement might have been declined in a way due to the US public insistence on no enrichment inside Iran. And therefore, you can see, for example, in recent days, more and more statements. There was even one event in Tehran where several politicians and associates of the ultra radicals inside Iran were holding a conference saying that Iran should stop negotiating with the West, that Iran should make no concessions over its enrichment capabilities, that the US should not be trusted. On the other hand, there are still those voices, for example, President Pezeshkian, who certainly wants to reach a deal because he understands not just the risk involved in military confrontation, but also he wants to get some kind of sanctions relief, which will allow him to put more efforts in his attempts to improve the Iranian economy. But at the end of the day, this is a decision to be made by the SNSC, the Supreme National Security Council in Tehran, which is mostly still consisted of I would say, between conservatives and hardliners. And the ultimate decision is made by Supreme Leader Khamenei. If Khamenei makes the decision to compromise, there is going to be a compromise. If he decides to not to allow any further talks with the United States, the Iranians can do that. When Khamenei just a few months ago was saying that he was against any kind of negotiations with the United States, I remember President Pezeshkian in one of his speeches, he said, I personally supported the idea of negotiations with the United States, but as soon as Khamenei said he was against it, I, as president, have to obey my leader, and therefore it's the decision to be made by Khamenei.
So it seems like this topic has been going on for almost decades, I would say, and there were always some climax points and escalation points. But it feels a little bit different this time, and that is because it seems that, like you said before, there is an understanding among the Israeli leadership that there's a window of opportunity that we may not have again, and that also there is a window of opportunity in terms of the ally that we have in the United States and the leadership in the United States that may not provide that kind of a green light or assistance if needed. So kind of a combination of factors that makes it on the Israeli side much more prone to consider much more thoroughly the consideration of let's go for the attack. From your perspective, you've been following this topic for a long time, and you know the Israeli perspective as well. How serious is this point of time we are now compared to other points of time? Is this another point of time in the negotiation that will lead to kind of a status quo, or do you really feel this time is a bit different?
I think we're at the closest point for a military escalation we ever were. I think that this time it's not just the political establishment in Israel. By the way, there is an almost consensus inside Israel within the political system, not just the coalition, also the opposition in Israel in favor of a military attack. But I think this is the dominant opinion even within the military security establishment. That there is a window of opportunity, and we have to do that again as long as we get some kind of green light from the United States. And therefore, unlike in the past, where one could assume that talks could continue for many months and even years without any kind of urgency, this time I think that it's not just this window of opportunity, and it's not just that we are heading towards a very major decision, either war or an agreement. I think that this time there is a sense of urgency due to the very advanced situation of the Iranian nuclear program. This is the first time that Iran has reached the point where it's, as I said, less than a week away from breakout. We've had several reports over the last year saying that Iran is undertaking several so-called suspicious initiatives in order to perhaps decrease or limit the timeline from making a decision to break out and the breakout itself. And therefore, there is a major concern in Israel that if there is no agreement and if Israel doesn't use military force, we might face at a certain point a situation where Iran makes a decision to break out, and this could be too late. And I think it also goes back to in a way, to the change in, I would say, the Israeli mentality since October the 7th. Israel is no longer ready to take risks when it comes to its vital national interests. We can see that in Syria, we can see that in Lebanon, and we can see that in Iran. I think that by now the sense in Israel is that Israel cannot allow itself to reach the point where there is an immediate threat, certainly when it comes to nuclear threat, which Israel could face in the near future. And if there is no deal in the very near future, my sense is that it's going to be very, very difficult to convince the Israeli leadership to refrain from using force.
So we're reaching the final minutes of our webinar. I want to ask you a question I always ask in those webinars, and that is if you can give us three scenarios. One is a worst case, best case, and a black swan scenario. You can start with any one of those. You can start with the best, worst, or the black swan. But if you can give us kind of, in short, three scenarios for how this situation, in your opinion, could evolve, what would be those scenarios?
Personally, I think that the best scenario would be a comprehensive deal, not an interim agreement and not a declaration of principles, which would impose major significant constraints on Iran's nuclear program when it comes to enrichment, when it comes to supervision, to verification, to sunset clauses, which will delay by many years Iran's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. This would be the best scenario, I think. The worst scenario would be a military strike which does not succeed, or which doesn't manage to get the objectives of significant delay in Iran's nuclear program. And we might find ourselves in a regional military escalation with an Iranian retaliation, which could, as I said, inflict a major damage to Israel, perhaps even casualties. And with this trajectory of further escalation, which nobody knows how to get out of it. Black Swan, there could be several ones. Khamenei could die tomorrow, and the entire situation is going to change. We could face an Iranian preemptive attack. I think it's very unlikely, but we have to take this into consideration. But I have to say that it's not a black swan, but I think that as I said before, my main concern is that we are going to be stuck with a declaration of principles signed between Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Arakchi, which will negate Israel from its ability to use military force. The Europeans are going to be left out without any ability to use the snapback, because it's either use it by October or lose it. And then we might see maybe stuck with a situation of an ongoing negotiations between Iran and the United States. Iran will remain a threshold state. Perhaps it will have to roll back some of its progress made in exchange for some sanctions relief. And I think this will be the best option for the Iranians and the worst option from the Israeli point of view.
Okay, and with that, we're going to conclude. Raz, thank you so much for taking the time and to provide us with some insights about this ongoing situation. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody who join us in our next webinars as well. Thank you.
Thank you.